Some deaths are accidents. This one was a choice. There are 100 small choices. You are standing at a trailhead right now, in your mind, lacing your boots, checking your phone for one bar of signal. The mountain ahead does not know your name. It does not know your plans, your deadline, your flight home on Monday. It will not rush to meet you, and it will not warn you twice. The wilderness has no opinion of you at all. That is the thing people mistake for safety. Indifference feels at first like permission. It feels like being left alone. It is not the same thing, and the difference between those two feelings is where this story begins. The camera on his chest harness did not know any of this either. It had no opinion, it did not panic when the light changed, and it did not argue when the trail narrowed to a shelf of loose stone. It simply recorded in the boots, the breathing, the small hesitations that come before every larger one. Cameras like this one capture something rescuers rarely get in other deaths. Not just the disaster, but the decisions that built it, frame by frame, hour by hour, each one reasonable enough on its own to pass without comment. That is the value of footage like this. It does not explain a tragedy after the fact the way a coroner's report does, in dry clinical language stripped of the moment itself. It shows the tragedy arriving, one ordinary choice at a time, long before anyone involved understood what they were building. These are the warnings they ignored. This is preventable. For Dale Anders, what began as a solo scramble up an exposed backcountry ridge would become his last. He was 34 years old, an experienced day hiker, with 6 years of Pacific Northwest trails behind him, and by most measures, a careful one. Friends describe him as methodical, the kind of person who read gear reviews before buying a headlamp, who kept a laminated checklist taped inside his pack's lid, who double-checked tire pressure before long drives. He was not new to this. That fact matters. And it matters more than most viewers assume. Most of the deaths this channel documents do not belong to first-timers, to the obviously unprepared, to people who wandered into terrain with no understanding of what they were entering. They belong to people experienced enough to trust themselves past the point where trust was still earned. People whose competence in 9 areas made the 10th one invisible, even to them. He had summited 11 peaks under 9,000 feet over those 6 years, always with a partner, always with a printed topographic map, folded into a side pocket out of old habit. A habit he had learned from an uncle who took him backpacking as a teenager. Back before phones carried maps of their own, those 11 summits had built something in him that outdoor psychologists sometimes call earned confidence, and something else quieter and more dangerous that they call accumulated exception. The sense that because caution had worked 11 times, it could be relaxed an 11th and a half. He ran a small outdoor gear review channel, 40,000 subscribers. Growing slowly, the kind of channel that lives or dies on new footage rather than any single viral moment. He had not posted in 3 weeks, and the algorithm, he had told a friend over text messages later recovered by investigators, punishes silence. He needed something, not just footage, a summit, a narrative arc, a thumbnail with a view worth clicking on, a story with a beginning and an end that fit inside 12 minutes. The pressure was small and constant, the kind that never announces itself as pressure at all, only as momentum, only as the next thing on a list that never seemed to shrink. The objective that day was Talus Needle, a 9,200-foot spire at the back of a glacial cirque, technically classified as a scramble rather than a technical climb. No ropes required for most of the route, no harness, no protection placed in rock, nothing that would show up on a gear list as dangerous. But the final 400 feet crossed an exposed knife edge with a fall line on both sides, a section of trail that shows up in nearly every trip report with some version of the same sentence. Not technically difficult, but you would not want to fall there. That sentence, repeated across dozens of independent accounts by hikers who had never met one another, was itself a warning, distributed in plain sight, ignored not. Because it was hidden, but because it read, to most people, like flavor text rather than instruction. He had done research, in the way most people now do research. He had watched a dozen other people's summit videos, scrubbing through them for the difficult sections, noting gear choices, noting how long the trip had taken others, building a mental model of the mountain out of other people's highlight reels. He had not, according to his phone's browser history later recovered as part of the investigation, checked the mountain-specific forecast issued that morning by the Regional Avalanche and Mountain Weather Center. A forecast built specifically for the exposure and elevation of terrain like Talus Needle, updated twice daily, freely available, and consulted routinely by the guides and rangers who worked that range professionally. He had checked a general consumer weather app instead, the kind built for cities and lowland towns. the kind that reports a single daily icon for an entire county, regardless of what the wind is doing 3,000 feet above the valley floor. Two forecasts existed that morning, describing two different afternoons. He read the one written for the wrong elevation and never learned there was a second one written for his. His plan was a 6-hour round trip, departing the trailhead at 7 in the morning, summit by 11, back at the car by 1 in the afternoon. A schedule built around daylight and, though he would not have phrased it this way, around a storm window he did not know existed. He packed 1 liter of water, a sandwich, a single soft shell jacket, and the camera, along with a spare battery and 2 spare memory cards, evidence of what the trip was really organized around. He told no one his actual route. His girlfriend believed he was hiking a different, easier trail 40 minutes south, the one he had posted about the week before, the one that photographed well from the parking lot, the one that would make sense to search first if anything went wrong, which eventually it did at a cost measured later in hours. Everything that followed looked reasonable, until the decisions began stacking together. Talus Needle sits in a range known among the rangers who patrol it as unforgiving in exactly the way that photographs beautifully. The approach trail climbs 2,800 feet over 4 miles through subalpine forest before breaking above the tree line into a boulder field, and it is here, on the exposed upper mile, that the mountain has done most of its collecting. Search and rescue records for the Cirque show 9 major incidents in the preceding 11 years, 3 fatalities, 4 serious falls, 2 hypothermia rescues. Nearly all of them concentrated on the same quarter-mile stretch of ridge, the same knife edge, the same short and unremarkable-looking traverse that every summit photo online seems to skip past in a single triumphant cut from boulder field to summit marker, as though the hardest and most dangerous part of the climb simply did not happen, as though it were an inconvenient detail rather than the entire point of the warning. The Land Management Agency posts a sign at the trailhead. It has posted the same sign in some form for over a decade. Afternoon thunderstorms build rapidly above 9,000 feet between June and September. Hikers should be off exposed ridgelines by noon. Solo travel on the upper mile is strongly discouraged. Now, rangers who patrol the area in summer months describe giving the same verbal warning dozens of times a season to hikers heading up in the wrong footwear, at the wrong hour, with the wrong mindset. A mindset built around a photo rather than a forecast. Around a destination rather than a window of time in which that destination was safe to reach. Most listen. Some do not. The mountain does not track compliance. It only tracks outcomes. And it does so with total consistency, applying the same physics to the careful and the careless alike. The forecast that morning, the one Dale did not check, called for a 70% chance of thunderstorms developing after 11, with winds gusting to 40 miles per hour along exposed terrain by early afternoon. It was, by the standards of mountain-specific forecasting, an unambiguous warning, phrased almost exactly like the trailhead sign itself, as if the two documents had been written by people who had watched the same mistake happen too many times. It was also, by the standards of a general-purpose weather app checked from a phone in a valley parking lot 40 minutes away, simply not visible at all. The ridge itself does not become dangerous gradually. It becomes dangerous at a specific point, roughly 400 feet below the summit, where the trail narrows from a wide boulder walk to a 2-foot wide spine of exposed rock with drops of over 500 feet on either side. Before that point, a fall means a bad afternoon, a twisted ankle, an embarrassing story told later at a bar. After it, a fall means a body recovery. Rangers refer to it informally as the door. Most incidents on the mountain happen on the far side of that door, in the last quarter mile, in the last hour before or after a summit, in the window where fatigue is highest and judgment is thinnest and the goal is closest. The exact window in which the human mind is worst equipped to make the decision the terrain requires of it. None of these dangers were hidden. They were simply accepted. The first decision was the start time. Dale left the trailhead at 8:40, not 7, delayed by a battery swap and a reshot introduction he wanted for the video. 3 attempts at a single sentence preserved in the footage, each one slightly more polished than the last, each one costing minutes he did not know he would need later. An hour lost in the morning is an hour lost against an afternoon storm that does not negotiate its own schedule to accommodate a content calendar. The mountain would begin building weather at the same hour regardless of what time he left the parking lot. Only his margin change, and margin on terrain like this is the only real currency a hiker carries. The second decision was the pack itself. 1 liter of water for a 6-hour exposed scramble in August is roughly half of what is generally recommended for that terrain and temperature, and he carried no additional layers beyond the single soft shell. No hard shell rain protection, no insulated layer, nothing rated for wind above 30 miles per hour, nothing he could put on if the sky did what mountain skies at that elevation reliably do in summer, which is turn without much warning to anyone not already watching for it. The gear that might have changed the outcome was not expensive, and it was not exotic. It was ordinary equipment, the kind his own channel had reviewed favorably more than once, simply left behind. The third decision came at the base of the boulder field at roughly 10:50 in the morning, where the wind had already begun to pick up and the first gray buildup was visible over the western ridgeline, clearly visible in his own footage, timestamped 10:51. He paused there. The recording shows him studying the sky for 11 seconds, long enough to register as a real hesitation rather than a passing glance, long enough that some part of him had clearly registered the change. He said nothing to the camera about it. He continued. The fourth decision was the turnaround time itself, or rather its absence. He had set none. Experienced mountaineers are trained to fix a hard turnaround hour before departure and to honor it regardless of proximity to the summit, precisely because proximity is what erodes judgment fastest. The closer the goal, the harder the discipline required to abandon it. Dale had told his camera at the trailhead that he wanted to be down by early afternoon. He had not written the number down. He had not told it to another human being who might hold him to it later, at the one moment it would have mattered most. The fifth decision came at the door. The narrow spine below the summit at 12:17 in the afternoon, according to the recovered footage's internal timestamp. Thunder is audible on the audio track, distant but unmistakable, at 12:19. 2 minutes after he crossed onto the exposed section. He continued filming. He narrated, in the clip later recovered by investigators, that he was close enough that turning back now would mean the whole day, the whole 4 miles, the whole reshot introduction had been for nothing. He was 190 feet by later GPS reconstruction from the summit marker, 190 feet against a 500-foot fall on either side, in wind that was still building, under a sky that had already told him twice what it intended to do. The sixth decision was the absence of every safety measure that might have interrupted the first 5. He carried no satellite communicator, no personal locator beacon, no way to call for help or check in from terrain with no cell signal, which described nearly the entire upper mountain. He had no partner to turn him around, to say the word first, to make the retreat a shared decision instead of a solitary act of will against a closing sky. No one expected a check-in from him that day because no one knew, correctly, where he was. Every safeguard that might have interrupted the chain had already been left in a drawer or never purchased at all, weeks before he ever reached the trailhead. Decisions made in comfort that would be paid for later, in weather on rock. By the time the mountain demanded a perfect decision, perfection was no longer possible. The recovered footage places the final sequence between 12:21 and 12:34 in the afternoon, 13 minutes in total, the shortest and most closely studied stretch of the entire investigation. Wind noise on the audio track increases sharply after 12:23, consistent with gusts investigators later estimated near 45 miles per hour along the exposed spine. Rain begins at 12:26, turning the rock's surface from dry, grippable stone to a slick, unstable film in a matter of minutes. A transformation the terrain there is known for, and one that requires no ice, no snow, only water and angle. His pace slows visibly in the last minutes of footage. His breathing, audible on the microphone, becomes shallower and more rapid, consistent with both physical exertion at altitude and the onset of acute stress. At 12:29, he stops to reposition the camera, and his hands are visibly unsteady, fumbling twice with a simple clip mechanism he had operated without difficulty earlier in the day. A small motor detail, but one consistent with early hypothermic impairment following rain exposure in high wind with inadequate layering. Judgment narrows under these conditions before the body fails outright. Investigators noted this pattern explicitly in their report. Decision-making capacity degrades measurably before physical collapse does, which is why the correct decision so often arrives several minutes after the window to act on it has already closed. At 12:31, the footage shows him attempting to descend rather than continue to the summit. A correct decision made roughly 12 minutes too late. His footing on the wet rock is already unsteady by this point. His steps shortened and tentative in a way they had not been on the ascent. His hand reaching twice for holds that were no longer where his instincts, built on dry rock, expected them to be. The final 18 seconds of recovered footage show a visible slip on the wet spine and the camera's abrupt reorientation, consistent with a fall. The recording ends at 12:34. No further footage exists. The camera stopped recording. The consequences continued. Dale's girlfriend expected him home by 3 in the afternoon and grew concerned by 5 when neither he nor his car had returned and calls to his phone went straight to voicemail. She reported him missing to local authorities that evening, describing the trails she believed he had taken. The easier one, 40 minutes south, the one from his last video. Search efforts began there at first light the next morning, delaying by roughly 14 hours the search of the correct drainage, 14 hours that, by the time they were spent, could no longer have changed the outcome, but that nonetheless illustrate a second, quieter failure sitting behind the first. Even the people who loved him did not know where he actually was, because the version of his plans he had shared was the one built for an audience, not the one built for safety. His vehicle was located at the Talus Needle trailhead early the following afternoon by a ranger conducting a routine sweep of area trailhead lots, after which search and rescue resources were redirected immediately. A combined team from the county sheriff's office, a volunteer alpine rescue unit, and a helicopter crew located his body that evening on a talus slope roughly 300 feet below the knife edge, consistent with a fall from the exposed section of trail. The camera was recovered intact, still clipped to the harness, its final files later extracted and reviewed as part of the investigation, forming the backbone of the timeline that made this reconstruction possible. The county coroner's office listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall, with hypothermia and impaired coordination noted as contributing factors in the investigative summary. The report specifically cited underhydration, inadequate weather-appropriate clothing, delayed turnaround decision-making, and solo travel on high-exposure terrain without emergency communication and equipment as elements of the incident chain. It did not use the word accident. It used the word preventable twice in its closing summary. A word choice rescue coordinators later said they did not take lightly and did not apply to every case that crossed their desks, reserving it specifically for deaths where the intervening choice, and not merely the terrain, was the deciding factor. His family released a brief statement thanking search and rescue volunteers and asking specifically that his story be used to encourage other solo hikers to carry a locator beacon and to tell someone their actual route, not the route that would make a better video. The Land Management Agency updated its trailhead signage within the year to include a more prominent, specific afternoon storm turnaround warning, citing the incident directly in internal briefing materials distributed to ranger staff the following season. Rescue coordinators who reviewed the case afterward pointed to a familiar pattern: an experienced hiker, competent in most respects, undone not by one large error but by the accumulation of several small and individually forgivable ones, each made harder to reverse by the one before it, until the final, correct decision arrived too late to be useful. Several of them noted in follow-up interviews that his case had already become a teaching example in local training briefings, used specifically because none of the individual failures were extreme. The mountain never changed, only the understanding of what happened did. You could have stopped this story at any one of a dozen points, and so could he. He could have delayed the trip a day, waited out a forecast that told the truth even when the app on his phone did not. He could have packed 2 liters instead of 1, a hard shell instead of nothing. The extra weight, a small tax against a large risk. He could have brought a partner, or someone whose voice at the door below the summit might have carried more weight than his own ambition did. Someone who could have said the word turn before the thunder said it for him. He could have carried a locator beacon costing less than a tank of gas, a device built for exactly the 90 minutes he did not have. He could have honored a turnaround time fixed before Pry had a vote in the decision. He could have listened to his own unsteady hands 13 minutes before the fall, when they were still trying to tell him something. He was not careless in the way people imagine carelessness. Reckless, showy, oblivious to consequence. He was careful about most things and wrong about a few that mattered more than the rest combined. That is how most of these stories end, not with a fool, with a person who almost got it right, who did nearly everything correctly except the handful of choices that counted most, and who, 190 feet from the summit, ran out of small decisions to get right, and every step of it was preventable. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. It might be the cheapest piece of survival gear you ever pick up. Want more preventable? These stories are next. Thank you for watching.